In the darkness between the stars, the weak and the faithless find no deliverance. We are raised to believe that the God Emperor watches over us all. And so we are charged to cleanse the mutant, the heretic, the alien. We must not falter. We are his sword. We are his wrath. Even in the face of death, we shall not submit. Suffering is our prayer. Faith is our armor. In battle, he offers us redemption. And for those who prove worthy, the Emperor sends forth his angels.
Our Imperium is besieged. Across 1,000 worlds, we fight for our survival. Those that would tear humanity down are legion. Our forces are few. Our enemies many. There is no respite. There is no mercy. And in our darkest hour, a spiteful universe awakens forgotten evils to break us. The galaxy burns, yet still we stand, the last bulwark against the terror. And while we draw breath, we will fight. For in this new dark age, there is only war.
So before I get into my full analytic breakdown for Warhammer 40,000 9th edition, first some thoughts about that trailer. I really enjoyed that trailer. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was bloody epic. Definitely not as dark as, say, Astartes, which has a much more serious vibe to it. This had a bit more sort of vibrant in the interactions and so on and so on, but it is definitely in keeping with what we have seen from Warhammer 40,000 for years and years in terms of those, the style of those trailers and so on. One thing I really enjoyed the Sisters because, the Sisters have always felt like this kind of secondary faction to me. It's been really good to kind of see them coming up. When they did the new Sisters release, which was only literally this year, so it's been very new and they've been releasing new models. So I've actually got an army of Sisters that I want to tie into the looting necropolis, and it's really good to kind of see them kind of kicking ass and being really full on. It's often felt to me like they haven't kind of had quite enough presence, so it's quite nice to see that coming in there. Then of course you got the Primaris Marines, and they're just kind of through and through in there. The biggest thing of course is the Necrons, and seeing the Necrons in this kind of new style. We haven't really seen too much of the Necrons animated, so seeing the Gorse weapons and how they're like disintegrating stuff, that's really, really cool. The one thing I just wish we had more of these animated trailers. I'm sure that they take a very long time to make, but just being able to visually see stuff. It's why I think everybody just wishes there was a series which had this visual style and presence, and it was like an ongoing series. Pray for the day when that will finally happen. This is why so many people are saying things like, well, hey, they should just employ the guy who does Astartes. But quite honestly, I think he's happy doing his own thing in his own style and having the freedom to do that. But anyway, before we move on to the next stuff, I just wanted to talk about my two favorite moments from this trailer. And funnily enough, it was not the Marines, because the Marines deal with the whole situation in a very Marine way. Charge forward, smash everything, guns everywhere. The first was this, because what you see is a sister damaged by the Necron, and she actually uses faith in the Emperor to heal her wound, the damage which has been done to her. And I don't think that's really been visually represented before. You can see she literally prays and then the wound starts to heal. And again, if you know anything about sisters and how the army functions, they have miracle dice to be able to, save themselves from things like this. So that was really cool. My other favourite is this part with the Imperial Guard where this guy gets taken down, and this guardswoman right here, she's just like, holy shit, I didn't know that could happen in the world. And then of course you see this sister come out and she's just like, I'm gonna destroy you. And so there's a great change in tone there between, obvious fear of an ordinary human and then the servant of the Emperor who is just ready to deal with the action. So I just like the play between those two things, but mainly I just like the look on her face when she sees her friend get disintegrated right in front of her. Let's get in and talk about the reveal itself, which is 9th edition for Warhammer 40,000. So, Games Workshop have been hyping up this new big reveal, and today we find out what it is, the reveal for 9th edition. Now, first off, as terrifying for those who enjoy playing the game may fear, because usually a new edition means much more for the tabletop gaming scene than it does for those who enjoy painting or the lore, things on the face of it look pretty okay. You're going to be able to use your existing codex, your existing models. The only thing that really sounds like it's going to be new will be, of course, the new rulebook and the changes to the Forge World stuff. And we already knew that the Forge World stuff was getting updated this year because that was announced ages ago. And actually, that's probably necessary and a good thing. I'll also note that today was really an announcement more than anything. There's a lot of information we're yet to know, so we can't really get deep into things just yet beyond, say, initial impressions. Also, things like delving heavily into codex details or rulebooks, that's not really something that I've done significantly here on the channel, so I'm not sure whether I will follow up this video, although, maybe I will consider doing that from here on as a new starting point. Would you guys like me to do that? Explain how to play and blah blah blah? What I will say though is that for me, happily, there is nothing too shocking about 9th arriving now either, because it is in fact perfectly on track with the general edition updating of 40k. Certainly no drama in it being announced now, because for example 2nd edition ran for 5 years, 3rd edition was the longest running at about 6 years from 1998 to 2004, 4th edition was about 4 years, 5th edition also about 4 years, 6th was a pitiful 2, and 7th edition was 3 years, 8th is now also on track to be about 3 years. So overall you can consider that on average the modern 40k editions are updated every sort of 3.5 years. 9th edition is bang on target for the regular schedule of updating. And just for those of you who don't know what a new edition means, primarily it means a new rulebook, a slight revision of kind of how things play in terms of the tabletop game. It usually doesn't mean that models become redundant, it's usually about the kind of core tabletop books like the rulebook and the codex. For those of us on the lore side of things, the fact that this big reveal was a new edition and not some big sweeping change to the lore should be very much a welcome relief, because I for one was getting ever more concerned that this was going to be some big, huge announcement that was preempting another huge cataclysm like the rebirth of the Emperor or who knows what. It seems though that the culmination of the Psychic Awakening narrative is the return of the Silent King, because Games Workshop have said that as part of this 9th edition reveal there's going to be a good year for the Necron armies, so we can anticipate new models there, which is quite honestly excellent, because everybody is always saying how Space Marines have been the core focus and this, and it's honestly gotten to a point where it's a little bit silly. So many people have got Space Marine armies that I swear I've seen online, people playing Marines versus Marines more than Marines versus Chaos or any Xenos, which is really just silly, because it's supposed to be humanity versus all these threats, not humanity versus humanity, because those are the only ones that people buy and want to play. To a degree, of course, people have always favoured Space Marines because they're Space Marines, they're the primary core upfront part of Warhammer 40,000. On the other hand, you really want to try and give those other races a chance to just make it interesting. So hearing that there's going to be a drive towards the Necron stuff, and of course what I would like to see as well, things like, more of the Inari, Orcs are well overdue for a big update, Tyranids, it would be great to see some new evolving things there as well, Tau, well, whatever, but but it all highlights just how much focus as well has been on the Primaris in the past few years, because that's the thing that they've been spearheading. Don't forget, of course, with Chaos, we've had Fabius Bile recently, so there's probably going to be some new stuff there, and, Imperial Guard, again, well overdue for new Imperial Guard there. I've often been considering recently, do I want to have a Xenos army? Do I want to have something like Tyranids? They've often caught my eye because they're awesome. But with this news about new Necron, it has me quite heavily considering a little dabble in that. But, we'll see. There is a big concern with a huge swathe of the community, of course, when it comes to lore, that 40k is going to see like an ever-sweeping tone of less grim darkness. We've discussed around this before, this worry that, a corporation like Disney is going to seek to exploit the success of Games Workshop in the past few years, and that kind of dilution of the core element of what 40k is all about remains always going to be a fear, because people want to keep their nice thing. They don't want to see it compromised. I will say that I think generally speaking there's pretty little sign of such a shift. Some of the novels and so on have had maybe a less harrowing tone than those in years gone by, but what I would say there is consider that there is more material being turned out faster than ever before, and the pool of authors is bigger than ever before, so that is kind of somewhat inevitable that you're going to get different viewpoints coming in. We remember that there was also like the whole kids books for 40k a while back, but I didn't even make mention of that because the absurdity of people worrying about that, freaking out, it turned out to be a whole lot of nothing. It was a storm in a teacup because they were kids books for the kids and nothing else changed. So personally speaking, I'm really not that concerned right now, not because I don't think that there's always this risk of a dark tone of 40k being diluted in the future to try and appeal to a wider audience, seeing less stories like the Demonculaba or other kind of harrowing things that we've discovered from Chaos and so on and so on. That stuff being toned down is always going to be a possibility, because experience shows that what regularly can happen if you look to video games when they reach a peak consumer level and want to keep on growing, what they tend to do is open it up to that broad audience. However, so far Games Workshop appear to understand that the value in the integrity of their narrative and product far outweighs doing this. And I would say to them, long may that continue. Listen to your core audience of viewers, because those are the people who will be there and remain buying the product, not people that will just come in on the fly and be like, ooh, what's this new thing? New people coming into a franchise is always a good thing, because you add more people to the pool, and it's, just great to share this kind of stuff. On the other hand, it shouldn't be at the cost of compromising the core narrative of what you have built over decades. What else can we discern from the reveal in the lore side of things? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, some, but not really very much. This is because the Psychic Awakening that's been the core focus of the new storyline, at its simplest, continues the run of information that is fairly established at this point, which in brief is the 13th Black Crusade, which then destroys Cadia, the Great Rift which is tearing the galaxy apart. We have the Inari trying to create the new Eldar god, the Necron are getting pretty skittish, and we have the return of the Silent King as well. Oh, and of course you've got Guilliman, Belisarius Cawl, tentatively leading things in a new-ish direction. The Mechanicus of late have been kind of experimenting with weird things, and they've been producing new units of their own. In terms of the narrative, I'll be looking to make a fairly comprehensive video on where we are with the new storyline fairly soon, because I say fairly soon, a couple of months. So I think now is probably a good time to start thinking about talking about that, because they're sort of getting to a break point, I think, with the Psychic Awakening, where it will be appropriate to get in an overview. There's been little point in doing so now, because they were announcing new Psychic Awakening books one after the other, and so it would be kind of stupid previously to try and get in there. The long and short of it, though, is that the return of the Necron Silent King raises the possibility of several devastating situations. If you didn't know the Silent King, he was the sort of original ruler of the Necron tier, and he basically enabled the transition of the Necron tier to the Necron, where they had their souls basically torn apart by the Catan. So he is a very ancient ruler, overseer of the whole of the Necron Empire. So him returning is a big deal, because he could kind of reunite the Necron, and then you could almost have like another war in heaven or something along these lines. So it is a big deal, him coming back. Personally, I would have preferred him to just not do that, but the fact that he is, it does have big implications. The first is that the Necron, who have been sort of really waking up around the galaxy but still remain not too much of a problem, suddenly become this new devastating force to be reckoned with. This is pretty bad news for the Imperium, that is already struggling more than it ever has since the heresy with its empire is now split in half. They're facing enemies everywhere, although to be fair they always have. The Emperor is still having a nice snooze meanwhile. The big thing is that we know from little fragments of the story that it seems the Necron likely originally sealed the warp away, and that they had the technology to do this. As much as the Eldar often claim in their fables and so on to, have been the ones who achieved everything, it actually appears that the Necron were far more important. They had a bigger hand in taking the initiative during the War in Heaven. It's possible from what we discern again in some of the novels that the Necron and the Eldar even collaborated to seal the warp away. So the Return of the Silent King could lay out some really major changes in the narrative. For one as well, he may see the threat of chaos being far more of a pressing issue than that of some weak-fleshed mortal humanoids, and focus on dealing with the rift and the ever aggressive incursions of chaos, and then maybe they just leave the galaxy. Who knows? On the other hand, he may try to do this and then simultaneously wage a terrible war on the mortal races, and of course the Eldar, who still have scores to be settled with them. Of course it could be none of this and something else entirely. We just have to wait and see. There was of course the reveal of the new Assault Intercessors, so for fans of Marines that's something people have been wanting for a long time. It goes of course hand in hand with them wanting to refresh the classic Marines to Primaris, so we're already marching steadily toward the ever increasing retirement of the classic Marines, which has gone from being, just likely to a full-on inevitability at this point. I think they're always going to be around, but definitely they're going to be taking a back seat from here on out, and that kind of is a sad thing. It's something I kind of always felt was going to happen, but it is what it is. I mean, I've had a few years now to kind of get used to that idea, so it doesn't feel quite as destructively bad as I thought. If they just come in day one and said Primaris are the thing and the rest of it's gone, that would have been absolutely devastating. But the kind of slow bleed they've done over time, it's kind of it is what it is. And then of course we had the Necron Warrior, New Dynasty. It all kind of makes sense with the Silent King returning. As I've mentioned previously, it's always good to have the Xenos getting some love in there, and the Necrons have needed this for some time. It's also very fitting when you tie this all in with the Psychic Awakening, but all the Xenos armies need updating. But it's certainly good to see the Necron retaining this very, very dark sort of vibe and feel. They're not just looking all shiny and polished up, so they definitely have this kind of resurrected feel to them, which they've always had, so it's good to see that consistency. One of the very biggest changes here is very obviously the logo for Warhammer 40,000. It really is shockingly different, although I suppose one could argue that if you're going to change a logo after 20 years, it needs to be different, or why bother at all? Now, I'll note that it is very difficult to see, but if you look at the eagle, it does retain the open eye on the left, so it still is technically an Imperium eagle, except that it looks very clean and futuristic. It almost looks a little bit Tau. Excuse me while I suppress my gag reflex, but as wildly different as it is, changing a logo doesn't happen without serious consideration. I'll also note that interestingly, as I said yesterday when talking about that Gap logo, people will inevitably flip out when a new logo comes along, and sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes not. I know I usually do just whenever any kind of visual thing changes, so people just generally hate change. And my first thought on seeing this logo was, dear Lord in heaven, what have they done? What have they done? The 8th edition logo for 40k had actually not changed since 3rd edition, which was way back in the halcyon days of 1998. So I think anybody would say 20 years is probably a fair period of time for an update. Not to mention the fact that in the past 2 years we've seen more new progression in the 40k narrative than probably all of the past 2 decades, relatively speaking. Having sat with the logo, had it on my screen for a while though, I think it's okay. I think it's fine. It'll probably warm to me. I definitely think it's not the worst thing. I think what's more interesting is about the style choice, because it's very clean and modern, and I think it's supposed to instill this idea of things moving forward technologically, which is why I think it has that style. It looks more like it's been printed out of a forge and less a relief carved into, say, an ancient cathedral, which was all to do with the kind of grim, dark, religious sort of spirit of the Imperium. But now things are starting to change because you've got Belisarius Cawl and so on. So I think that the importance of this logo change shouldn't be overlooked. I do tend, though, to read too far into things always, I know I do that, but when you think where we are with the narrative in 40k, and like I said, the changing Imperium with Cawl and Guilliman, we've often discussed that the rise of the ecclesiarchy and the suppression of forward technological development goes really against the ideals of the pre-heresy Imperium. It's worth remembering that all the dark stuff in the Imperium happened after the Primarchs were out of the way, and the Emperor was still just then a corpse. So given that Guilliman is back and also that things are looking bleaker for humanity than ever, they're already starting to kind of bend the rules and sort of move in a different direction. It may be that the ecclesiarchy and so on will have to take a bit of a back seat, but that has problems of course of its own. That Core will come in and be pushing new developments ever forward. It could also be a mild nod to races like the Tau coming forward and bringing some refreshing new strength to the galaxy. It does seem like the Tau are due as well, another expansion, and perhaps that's another race that needs some improvement in Ninth. You know, the weakened Imperium is being distracted by other things, perfect opportunity for the Tau to capitalise on that. Overall, that's my vague interpretation of the logo. So lastly, let's get into some of the details, because there is an FAQ which dives into the details of the 9th edition stuff, and honestly it's not as devastating as people might fear. I think honestly it is not a bad thing, but for those who don't play the game in terms of the tabletop, it's not really going to matter to know. But look, when it comes to the data and specific unit abilities, these can be regularly tweaked with either a codex update or what are known as errata. This is usually a PDF that gets released by Games Workshop that tweaks or clarifies certain things, except these are usually infrequent and pretty small. In 8th there was a lot of errata, and so hopefully 9th will consolidate those changes and we'll have less of them in the future, so that you're not having to constantly keep track of which this and that has changed when you want to play a game. They described 9th as not being a complete rebuild, which is a good thing, but it is a revolutionary design taking on board years of player feedback. Again, we'll have to wait and see. They say that they want to make this the best yet. In doing so, they've considered changing the phases in the game, mission points, stratagems, and that they're still weeks away from showing us these details. So that stuff is still to come. Happily, and to the surprise of no one, your existing army will still be valid, and more interestingly, they note that all codecs will still work with the game, and so will things like the Vigilus campaign, Psychic Awakening, other 8th edition supplements. And this is particularly interesting, but also a good thing. I'm not sure people would suddenly be so excited to have to go out and buy new codecs again, least of all when the Space Marine updated codex only came out barely 6 months ago, but this suggests that the changes that they're going to make to the game have more to do with how it actually plays and less to do with the tweaks to, say, unit stats and traits and so on and so on. Although they do also say that things will change and have been balanced, which hopefully means there will be some tweaking to Marines, he says, as an owner of a Marine army. Though I do note that new codexes as well, they will be coming eventually for 9th, but again, that's no surprise to anybody, this is fairly standard. A couple of points about sort of game mechanics and so on. The command points are relative a bit more to your size of your army. What that's really talking about is how you structure your force in order to get command points. And again, if you're not into the tabletop, won't mean too much, but that is a positive thing because it means you can kind of add more variation and different sort of units you want to bring. Tanks firing from when in close combat, not getting tackled by tons of small minions. Again, it's a good thing to put that in there, just didn't really make any sense, because if you're in a gigantic tank, why do you care if there's a little Gretchen attacking you? Having big guns that are meant to take out these huge hordes of infantry, like Tyranids and stuff coming your way, going to be more effective, have more of an impact, which is also a good thing, because sometimes you have these huge cannon and they just kind of felt a bit toothless. Why instead you might see people preferring to just lay down a massive wave of bolter fire. That's a hopeful thing, that's going to change things up and just kind of add a bit more dynamic to the game. So again, feel pretty hopeful that that's going to be a positive change. So another thing which wasn't too clarified but sounds positive, terrain rules changing. I'm really glad about that, because terrain rules have been very oversimplified for the longest time in terms of all aspects really within 8th edition, because the whole point of 8th was they wanted to make it streamlined, fast and easy to play, but they kind of went too far, and there were some things where it was just like, this doesn't really make sense, it's stupid, it's too simple. So that's something I want to hear more about, because that was always an interesting thing to me, having, you know, a well-built battlefield in terms of your terrain and actually making it work, and you know, you spend all this time developing that stuff, it doesn't really feel like how it's supposed to be. So yeah, one other thing they mentioned as well was about scale, making the game work at different lengths, say for like an hour right through to a game which lasts a whole day. Not sure how that's going to function. It's quite interested to see about how that's going to work, because on the stream they said this wouldn't compromise or dilute the way in which 40k functions as a tabletop game, but that's pretty hard to know. You know, how is that going to function in terms of time scale? I don't know how they're going to condense those things and actually make it still function, how it feels at a larger game scale, so interested to see as well more information about that. Another thing to make note is that new models will continue, but they specifically mention Necrons for this year, which makes sense. Points are going to be changing, and seemingly not in a small way. This is a pretty big deal, I think. They say that there will be a lot of point changes to your armies, either to balance them or to reflect efficiency of units that are going to be more powerful as a result of these core rule changes. So there's definitely more to this, and we need to have extra information to really find out. They hint at, but don't confirm, that there will be a new box game for the 9th, and that also seems fairly inevitable, and will be interesting to see what is going to be included there. So far, the 40k box sets have tended to include enemy like Orc and Chaos, so it will be very interesting to see possibly, say, a Necron army in a box set for 40k. Will this mean that we maybe get some new Marines there as well? Or imagine, if you can, a box set but without the Imperium. I think that will never happen, obviously, because humanity is the core of 40k, but it would be nice to include a force with an attachment that has, like, say, an Inquisitor or something that isn't just base Space Marines. There's going to be a new system in 9th edition called Crusade, which is apparently going to be a more narrative way of building an army in a meaningful way. Now, I am perhaps most excited about that because this means that you have the opportunity to develop more background and so on for your custom army. Now, you've always had the ability to do that. Obviously, I like to do that in general when I'm building armies or stuff for, Necromunda and things like this. And I know many of you guys have asked me questions about lore related to your own armies that you have been building. For myself, for example, I've been thinking about developing an army around the Luton Necropolis, so this means things like Sisters of Battle, Knights, Imperial Guard, and the Orcs. They did mention with the Crusade system that there would be kind of experience gained and that one battle would go on to another and another. It sounds quite similar to how Necromunda would function, or indeed really any kind of RPG system. So the idea that you have a force and you're kind of keeping track of its units and its stats, and if a character dies, that character is dead. Basically like a very narrative way of playing. That adds a lot of interest because potentially that enables you to make certain characters more and more powerful as they go through from a battle. So instead of your Space Marine captain just having a standard set of stats, if he does really well in a battle, he could become ever more powerful until he's becoming like this supreme master. Certain Marines, your sergeant in a squad gets killed, another Marine takes over. So there's all sorts of things like that, and that can make for some really interesting play if you have the time and the resources in terms of people around you to commit to that kind of play. But it is something that's really exciting. I wish I could have the opportunity to do that. So depending on how this Crusade system works, it may be that I develop a whole background related to that and the Luton Necropolis fan fiction that I was working on, and then lay this stuff out for you guys in a series of videos. I think that could be a really exciting, fun way to integrate and test out this new system, or at least give you guys just the ideas to kind of work with. The same as now, the core rules will be in a short primer version which tells you the basic tenets of 40k. It's going to be available for free, and if you didn't know that, it's been a thing for a long time. You can download the core rules for free from the Games Workshop website. Most 40k units, when you buy them now, include a basic data sheet, so technically speaking, you could actually just buy units and nothing else, and you'd probably be able to have something of a bare bones game of 40k. Really though, this core set is just like a quick start guide to help people understand the game in a very short format. And that's really it for the 9th reveal. I hope this has been somewhat coherent because I've had to try and put it together quite quickly. But for me, and I say this sincerely, I feel actually pretty hopeful for this. 8th was a big shake-up in terms of how the game was played, and some things were for the better and some not so much. However, we must obviously retain judgment until we can see the new rulebook and understand more about just what is going to be changed. Because 8th was a big change, I think the best thing that 9th can do is to consolidate the best and cut out the other bits that work less well. It seems a pretty obvious thing to do. I personally was not a big fan of, say, vehicles being able to just fire everything in any direction. Never really made a lot of sense to me, but the less said about Marine metas, the better. I hope that 9th balances classic Marines better against Primaris. That seems like, maybe a futile hope, but that's what I hope for, to better suit the classic Marines experience and to try and keep them relevant, at least for this next edition. I think if classic Marines become redundant at around 10th edition, this would be a sad thing, but perhaps just something that will have to be accepted. My army is basically a core of classic Marines, but we all have to accept that sometimes things change, sometimes they stay the same. I think it would be simply naive at this point to try and argue that classic Marines have a high worth for the future. However, I think also it would be correct to say just look at the progression of Marines from the 30k iteration to the 40k Marines. The change between that time was already quite a shake-up in terms of their varying armour, equipment and attitudes. Primaris has obviously been a far bigger leap, but still, perhaps in some ways it's right and fitting, he says, desperately trying to rationalise. My next thought is that I hope that they do not release the new codex until toward the end of the summer. I think it would just feel a bit grubby to have to shelve my near mint condition 8th 2019 codex so soon after purchase. However, when they come to releasing the new box set and the rules and so on, I think it's fairly inevitable that the codex are going to come along there as well. The same goes for my sister's codex. I've really had that for a short period of time. I would be hopeful that I would get some use out of it into at least the summertime, but we'll see how that goes, and we'll see how much changes. Maybe they will kind of both be valid for a time throughout the rest of this year. As for the lore of it all, well, time will tell. We already have a fair guesstimation on where things are headed. My big relief, as I said, from this announcement for 9th is that they have not just kind of crowbarred something in to jazz up the release of 9th edition. So there's no galaxy-changing mad events like, as I said, something with the Emperor or Chaos Gods or the birth of the Eldar God or whatever. I think it's best that those things remain on the sort of peripheral agenda, because one of the best things I've always thought and felt about 40k is this feeling that things are just about to get very full on. You know, you're just on the precipice of everything absolutely just about to become a total disaster, but not yet. Not yet. So as for 9th, that is my thoughts about it today. Please tell me yours down below. I'm off to crack on with the next now overdue lore video. Thanks as always guys for watching and supporting me and the channel. Give it a like if you enjoy, and I'll see you in the next one.